In recent weeks, one image quietly took over the internet. No flashing lights, no red carpets, just a beach, a slow walk, and a woman who looked like she was carrying more weight than anyone could see. The headline did the rest. Romy Reiner, photographed walking beside her boyfriend, days after the murders of her parents, Rob and Michele Reiner. For most people, it was just another thumbnail. For others, it became a question. And for some, it became a judgment. But what almost no one stopped to ask was what led to that moment in the first place. Because this story did not begin on a beach. It began with a crime that ripped through a family and left behind more questions than answers. Rob and Michele Reiner were not public figures chasing attention. They were private people living private lives. And when they were murdered, the details did not arrive neatly packaged. They arrived fragmented, delayed, and surrounded by speculation. And in that gap between facts and silence, the internet rushed in. People began analyzing expressions, body language, timing, why she was outside, why she was not alone, why she looked the way she did. That is how these stories always twist. The focus shifts away from what happened and lands on how someone reacts to it. But grief does not announce itself. It does not follow scripts. And it does not stop just because a camera appears. What most viewers never see is the moment after the phone call. The moment when life splits cleanly into before and after. The moment when shock replaces logic and time stops behaving normally. That is where Romy Reiner was standing, long before that photograph was taken. Before the headlines, there was trauma. Before the speculation, there was loss. And before the internet decided what her grief should look like, there was a daughter trying to stay upright. This is where the story starts to matter. Because without understanding the truth of the murders themselves, what is known, what is confirmed, and what has been distorted, every reaction that follows becomes meaningless noise. In cases like this, silence gets mistaken for secrecy. Normal behavior gets mistaken for indifference. And presence gets mistaken for recovery. But survival often looks quiet. And coping often looks ordinary from the outside. The reality is simple and uncomfortable. You cannot measure devastation through a single image. You cannot map grief onto a timeline. And you cannot understand this story without going back to the beginning. That is why this video does not start with speculation. It starts with facts. In the next part, we will walk carefully through what is actually known about the murders of Rob and Michele Reiner. Not the rumors, not the assumptions, but the verified truth. And only after that will we return to Romy Reiner to understand that beach walk not as a headline, but as a human moment inside a much larger tragedy. Stay until the end, because what we uncover there changes the way this entire story should be seen. When violent stories break, people expect clarity, names, motives, timelines. But in real life, the truth rarely arrives all at once. The murders of Rob and Michele Reiner did not unfold in public view. They did not come with dramatic footage or immediate answers. They emerged slowly, through official statements, fragments of reporting, and long stretches of silence. What is known is simple and devastating. Rob and Michele Reiner were found murdered, victims of a violent crime that immediately shifted from a private nightmare into a public case. Law enforcement confirmed the deaths. Investigations began. And from that moment on, everything changed for the people left behind. What followed was not resolution, but uncertainty. Details were limited. Information was controlled. And as authorities worked quietly, the public filled the gaps loudly. That is always the danger point. Because when facts move slowly, speculation moves fast. Online theories began forming before investigations had time to breathe. Motives were guessed. Connections were imagined. Silence was interpreted as concealment. But investigations do not unfold for audiences. They unfold for accuracy. In cases involving violent crime, especially when families are involved, law enforcement often withholds information for reasons the public never sees. Protecting evidence. Protecting witnesses. Protecting the integrity of the case itself. That silence is not suspicious. It is procedural. What matters is what can be confirmed. And just as importantly, what cannot. There is no verified evidence suggesting public conspiracies. No confirmed reports supporting many of the theories circulating online. And no indication that the case fits neatly into the narratives people want it to be. What exists instead is something far less dramatic and far more real. Crime, an investigation, and a family living inside the aftermath. This is where stories like this become dangerous. Because the absence of information invites imagination. And imagination, when repeated enough times, starts to sound like truth. But truth does not need volume. It needs patience. The murders of Rob and Michele Reiner are not a puzzle for public entertainment. They are an active tragedy with real consequences, handled through legal processes that do not answer to social media timelines. And while people online debate what they think happened, the reality is that grief does not wait for conclusions. For Romy Reiner, the truth of that loss did not depend on press releases or official updates. It arrived instantly, permanently, and without explanation. That is the part that often gets overlooked. Before suspects, before theories, before closure, there is shock, there is disbelief, and there is the slow realization that nothing will return to what it was. Understanding this matters, because without grounding this story in what is known and refusing to inflate what is not, everything that follows becomes distorted. This was not a mystery designed for spectators. It was a violent rupture in a family's life. And until the full truth is legally and officially established, the only responsible position is restraint. Which brings us back to Romy Reiner. Because while the public waits for answers, life continues, unevenly, painfully, and without instructions. In the next part, we return to her. Not to speculate, but to understand how someone exists inside unresolved loss, and why moments that look ordinary from the outside often carry the heaviest weight. And by the time we reach the end, the image that started this story may no longer look the same. After violence enters a life, everything that follows feels slightly unreal. Time stretches, memory blurs, and ordinary actions start carrying unfamiliar weight. For Romy Reiner, the days after the murders were not marked by statements or appearances. They were marked by absence. The absence of parents. The absence of routine. The absence of the future she had assumed would always be there. This is the part of tragedy that cameras never capture. There is no clear beginning to grief. It does not arrive all at once. It leaks in slowly, through moments that should feel normal, but no longer do. People often imagine grief as something loud, crying, breaking down, disappearing from the world. But in reality, it often looks quieter than that. It looks like getting dressed because staying in bed feels worse. It looks like stepping outside because the walls feel too close. It looks like motion without direction. That is where Romy Reiner was. She was not performing resilience. She was not signaling recovery. She was navigating shock. Psychologists describe early grief as a survival state. The mind focuses on small, manageable actions because the full weight of the loss is too large to process at once. Presence becomes a coping mechanism. Routine becomes a lifeline. This is why judging behavior in the immediate aftermath of loss is almost always misleading. Being seen does not mean being okay. Being calm does not mean being healed. And being accompanied does not mean being unaffected. For many people, connection is not optional after trauma. It is necessary. The presence of another person helps anchor reality when everything else feels unstable. Silence feels heavier when carried alone. That context matters. Because Romy Reiner was not moving through grief privately. She was doing it under observation. Every step interpreted. Every expression evaluated. Every appearance turned into a narrative. And that pressure changes everything. Grief under surveillance becomes distorted. Natural coping strategies get misread as statements. Neutral moments get assigned meaning they were never meant to carry. But grief does not send messages. It does not explain itself. And it does not owe the public a performance. What Romy was experiencing was not closure. It was adjustment. The slow and uneven process of learning how to exist in a world that has permanently changed shape. This is the stage where many people appear functional while feeling fractured underneath. Where laughter can exist alongside devastation. Where movement coexists with numbness. It is not contradiction. It is human response. Understanding this reframes everything that follows. Because when grief is mistaken for indifference, empathy disappears. And when empathy disappears, judgment rushes in to fill the space. Romy Reiner did not choose to grieve publicly. But once the story became visible, privacy became impossible. That is why moments that seem small take on outsized meaning. A walk, a conversation, a shared presence. Which brings us directly to the image that sparked this entire discussion. In the next part, we look closely at that beach walk, not as a headline or a controversy, but as a moment viewed without context, and what happens when the public mistakes survival for something else. And by the end, the assumptions surrounding that image may no longer hold. The photograph itself is unremarkable at first glance. A shoreline, open space, two people walking side by side. And yet, it became the center of the conversation. Romy Reiner and her boyfriend, captured during a quiet walk along the beach. No gestures for attention. No attempt to address the cameras. Just movement, framed by distance and light. But once the image was released, interpretation took over. People did not ask what the moment meant to her. They asked what it meant to them. Why a beach? Why now? Why with someone else? Those questions reveal more about public expectations than personal reality. After tragedy, there is an unspoken rule society often imposes that grief must be visible, isolated, and uninterrupted. That normal life should pause indefinitely, and that any sign of connection signals progress that feels inappropriate to outsiders. But grief does not suspend the need for support. In moments of deep loss, companionship is not a distraction. It is stabilization. Another presence helps regulate emotion, ground thought, and provide silence that does not feel empty. That is what the image likely captured. Not celebration, not escape, but steadiness. The boyfriend in the photograph was not a statement. He was context. A human anchor in a moment where the world felt unsafe and unfamiliar. Yet online, the narrative shifted. Some framed the image as indifference, others as premature recovery, a few as controversy. None of those interpretations accounted for timing, psychology, or reality. Walking does not mean moving on. Being outside does not mean forgetting. And being accompanied does not mean pain has diminished. For many people in acute grief, stillness is the hardest state to endure. Movement, even slow, aimless movement, offers relief from intrusive thoughts and emotional overload. Natural environments, especially open spaces like beaches, are often used instinctively as grounding spaces. This is not unusual. It is common. But when private coping mechanisms become public images, nuance disappears. The photograph freezes a fraction of time and invites conclusions it was never meant to support. And once an image is labeled, it becomes difficult to undo. Romy Reiner did not explain herself. She did not respond. And that silence was interpreted too. But silence after trauma is not avoidance. It is protection. Some experiences are not meant to be narrated in real time. Some losses require distance before they can be understood, let alone explained. What the image truly shows is not recovery. It shows continuity. Life continuing unevenly, imperfectly, and without resolution. That is the uncomfortable truth people struggle with. Tragedy does not pause the world. And surviving it does not look dramatic. The beach walk was not the story. It was the aftermath. And without understanding everything that came before it, the crime, the shock, the grief, the image becomes misleading. Which is why the final piece of this story matters most. Because how we interpret moments like this says less about the person in the photograph and more about how we consume tragedy itself. In the final part, we step back from the image entirely and confront what this story ultimately reveals. Not about Romy Reiner, but about empathy, judgment, and the way modern audiences process loss. And that is why staying until the end matters. By the time stories like this reach the public, they are no longer just about events. They become mirrors. What we choose to focus on, what we choose to question, and what we choose to judge. The murders of Rob and Michele Reiner were the beginning of this story, not the spectacle. A violent rupture that left behind silence, trauma, and lives permanently altered. Everything that followed happened inside that shadow. But the attention did not stay on the crime for long. It shifted, quietly, toward behavior. A photograph replaced a timeline. An expression replaced a fact. And a private moment became a public test. That shift matters. Because when tragedy turns into content, empathy becomes optional. People stop asking what happened and start asking how someone should act afterward. And those expectations are rarely fair. Romy Reiner did not ask to be observed during the worst period of her life. She did not present herself as an example of strength or recovery. She was simply existing inside loss while the world watched. That is the part most people miss. Grief is not a performance. It is not consistent. And it does not resolve on schedule. Some people withdraw. Some seek connection. Some move. Some go still. None of these responses invalidate the pain underneath. The image that sparked this conversation will eventually fade from feeds. Headlines will change. Algorithms will move on. But the loss will remain, long after public interest disappears. That is the imbalance at the center of modern tragedy. We consume moments. Others live consequences. This story was never about a beach walk. It was about how quickly context is stripped away and how easily judgment replaces understanding when patience runs out. And that is why the full story matters. Because when we slow down, when we examine facts before reactions, grief before assumptions, and humanity before narrative, the image looks different. Not controversial. Not confusing. Just human. If there is anything to take from this, it is not a conclusion about Romy Reiner. It is a reminder about restraint. About the cost of turning private pain into public opinion. The truth is often quieter than the headline, and compassion rarely goes viral. This is why we asked you to stay until the end, because understanding the full picture changes how we see the moment that started it all. Not as something to judge, but as something to respect. And sometimes that shift is the only resolution a story like this can offer. If you value thoughtful storytelling over headlines, leave your perspective in the comments and subscribe for more documentaries like this.